I wanted to take a bit of time today to speak into some pretty remarkable experiences that I've had brought about by meditation. Meditation? That's a new thing I invented. Meditation and contemplation over the last year or so, especially. I've been practicing some form of meditation slash contemplation since I was in my late teens, like 17, 18 years old. That's when I originally got into Buddhism and more philosophy, that kind of thing. And I think just generally, even back then, I think I was very interested in the exploring consciousness subjectively, and anything that seemed to be an avenue for that, I would follow really readily. Over the years, it's dwindled on and off. Like, there have been times where I've not really been formally practicing anything. And then there have been other times where I've been very invested and very involved in a certain kind of practice, system or structure. Over the last year, I've been more interested in Zen Buddhism. Not any particular branch of Zen. I've practiced the more, like the shikantaza, like the just sitting and the just complete letting go or allowing. That's more resonant with me for some reason. And I've also done quite a lot of the koan practice, like, for example, if you're familiar with the koan mu or these kind of things, like these koan being like a riddle that you don't really ever find a direct answer to. And I've gone back and forth between these things, and I've mixed that and blended that with my own contemplations. And I suppose even when I'm not directly contemplating something, I think my mind tends to be in a state of contemplation. The way I would differentiate meditation and contemplation is meditation's kind of more of a centering in, where contemplation is more of a opening up. It's a kind of letting go of formal structures and sort of exploring the possibilities of something, whether you're doing that purely in mind or you're doing that at a more consciousness-centered level. In one way, shape, or form, I'm always practicing some of that. But brought about by this interest in Zen Buddhism, over the last year, I've been doing that really consistently. And it's yielded some quite remarkable results. And it's often very difficult to talk about with people. And I think it's because what you're speaking about, if you've had one of these or some of these kinds of experiences, I've heard, I'm really kind of like cautious about saying any of these like buzzwords in the spiritual community, like enlightenments or awakenings or things like this. Just because I often find that gets a bit messy, and like obviously, like, if someone watching this was a much more advanced student or a mystic, they might think like, oh, that's not really a Kensho or a Satori, and that's fine. Like, I'm just literally highlighting some things that have happened within my experience. So the term that I'll be using for this is opening. These openings that I've been experiencing over the last they've been before this last year, but the last year, through this practice of Zazen, things have really ramped up, I would say. Instead of trying to draw my memory back to these really specific points when these happened and I had these experiences, I thought that it might be better just to draw on the common denominators, because these openings have happened quite a few times, and some of them have been more, it's like there's more of a sort of permanent shift or recognition, and then other times it's more like something very, very intense or dramatic that's followed by a strong emotional release or something like that, but then it kind of seems to fade off into sort of a memory quite quick, which is an interesting thing, because when it's happening, it doesn't really seem like there's any time. It seems like time is just not, like, it's funny how usually we walk around thinking that we're in time. But from this kind of experience, this kind of opening, time is like gone. It doesn't really exist in that same way. And you realize how that you're sort of projecting that onto everyday experience as a way to categorize and render and make sense of it. But what's funny is you have this opening, and then it's almost like you sink back into time space. So it's like there's a disappearance, and then there's a coming back into time space. And I've had that happen like quite dramatically a fair few times now. So I'd probably do better just to touch on the common denominators and the things that have presented themselves most clearly to me. The first thing I would say that's very interesting is the best description I've seen of this, and something that was a really useful pointer for me, was there is a YouTube channel called Simply Always Awake, and the whole channel is about awakening, enlightenment. And the guy who runs the channel, Angelo Giululo, I bought his book, and he's a pretty interesting kind of teacher. I like his style. He has something that he talks about. It's not that much, but he has a few videos about it, and he talks about it a bit in his book, and it's called Unbound Consciousness. And I was very interested when I heard his explanations of like a thought and things like that. It's a very unique way of explaining these kind of things, because some teachings, like even in the Zen teachings, there does seem to be this thing where I think some Roshis don't really know how to speak about thought, because it's like they don't get close enough to how it is in experience. They just sort of generalize, because I think they have to generalize to give the teaching. But this guy, Angelo Giululo, he gets quite specific with like following the waves of thought consciousness. And he sort of says in his Unbound Consciousness stuff, just type in Simply Always Awake Unbound Consciousness if you're interested in seeing him talk about this. But the way he sort of explains unbound consciousness is that usually we think of ourselves or believe ourselves to be an entity having thoughts and feelings and experiences. Like it's kind of obvious to us that that's the case, and we believe that we live in a world and that we're in a room. We have all these things that we take for granted, basically. But what he's saying is we usually assume that the entity is doing the thinking. Like I'm a person, a solid thing here with a brain that's doing thinking. But what we don't tend to notice is how the very sense that you are an entity and have a brain and can think, that there is one having thoughts, is in fact itself a form of thought. Because if not, you wouldn't know about it. Like, even if you look into the room in front of you right now, you can't find any real entity that's there. There's just sights. There's just the experience of seeing. In fact, you can't really even find objects in a room. I know that sounds quite radical. To some people, this seems very radical, and to other people, when you explain these things, they actually they get it right away. Like, they seem to have this ability to be like, yep, okay, no, I get what you mean. But usually we think of a room in terms of objects. But if you were more close, or if you wasn't so identified or attached to certain rendering processes that the mind goes through, there is actually just sort of room. There is just this. And because no entity is really found there, what you recognize is that the thinker, so as well as the thoughts, is all just sort of one chain of consciousness. And it's not necessarily, like if you investigate it a bit closer, it's not necessarily that it's a series of thoughts. It is kind of just one thought. It's a kind of consciousness. Physicality is a kind of consciousness. Sight is a kind of consciousness. Sound is a kind of consciousness, right? There's not any actual sounds or sights out there, but obviously from the perspective of this organism, it seems that that's what the world is made up of. What Angelo does quite well is point out the kind of the subtleties. Like if you really truthfully investigate what thoughts are in that way, what can happen, and I can guarantee you this from personal experience, is that there can come a point where the whole scheme or spectra of thought becomes illuminated by or within, is maybe the closest term I could use, within something else entirely. It's almost like your whole existence you recognize is in something else, actually. There is something a lot bigger and more fundamental than the experience of being a person or an entity. And it's never not like that. That's actually another thing that becomes very clear, I think, when this happens. It's never not the case that is always like that. It's just that the tendency to grip onto or to identify with being a person is so automatic that it's quite difficult to extricate yourself from it. And that's why meditation and contemplation and whatnot are necessary for most people to recognize this, because there has to come a point where that's very clearly illuminated. And so what it seemed like to me through these experiences is that not only are all the objects of thought illuminated very clearly as consciousness, but the thinker is also illuminated as consciousness. And even subtle, distant murmurs of mind and thought are illuminated as consciousness. And it's like a lightning bolt strikes across the sky of mind and illuminates the whole space. And so obviously this is quite interesting because there's a strong disidentification with like the entity. And it seems to be that the nature of this more fundamental self, like a self with a capital S, as some teachers would say, it seems to be that the nature of this more fundamental self is basically like untouched peace. Peace, I think, even peace is not really accurate, because peace is like a reflection of that nature rather than the thing itself, because the thing itself is no thing, like it doesn't exist, basically. True fundamental nature is actually empty, so it seems. Even the notion, this is something that's quite difficult also to talk about in Zen. They talk about shunyata or ku, this idea of like emptiness, kind of a formless nature. They talk about it in different Buddhist teachings. You know, it's often talked about like aggregates, where they talk about things like rupa, you know, the existence of form and world or feeling, these different kinds of ways that a person can become identified with aspects of consciousness, of experience, and then confuse their true identity. But when the more fundamental self is illuminated, it becomes quite obvious that it doesn't really have any substance to it. So when you think from that position, it just seems like thought itself is doing different things, but it doesn't feel like you're the person thinking. The whole notion or idea of you being the person thinking seems to take place within the more fundamental emptiness of self. And it's the same with the world. Like, from that vantage point, it's quite obvious that there is still a sense of things existing around you and the world around you, but that all seems to take place within you. So what's recognized is that the self is more fundamental than anything here. And that's pretty fucking wild to realize. Because I think, like, for me, this was quite wild to recognize, because it's like, you realize how there's so much talk and debate in religion about what's true this, and if there's a God, and if there's anything after we die, or there's this or that. But so quickly, upon having this experience, or having some experience like this, so quickly is all of that's like wiped away. Like, there's a certain longing or curiosity that disappears within that. So it seems like there's something that's paradoxically both completely and utterly uncertain, because it's completely unknown, and it's obvious that it could never be grasped or understood in the way we conventionally grasp at or understand anything. But simultaneously, there's a certainty that comes with it that's beyond the scope of anything that you could ever be certain of. You know? And I think for me, these things have been quite funny. I'm not trying in any way to like build some like hierarchy or be like, oh, now I understand it. It's not like that at all, actually. I say this with as much humility as I could muster. But just personally, what's been interesting is, like, you know, you get those like commercials that come up on YouTube and stuff from like certain spiritual institutions, and they're like really like, oh, like when you open your heart and you have your anahata and the crystal falls from the sky and heals the wounds. Like, it's got this kind of like, there's this spiritual vibe or energy, this like hippy dippy spiritual vibe or energy. And you realize like how much of that is just like has nothing to do with spirituality, really. It's all actually just more identification and more personal stuff. Like, there are features or qualities of that stuff that are quite amazing sometimes, like if it's done properly and it initiates connection, or if there's like healings that can be done through Reiki or natural medicine or all these kinds of things like that that are not conventional. That's amazing. But at the same time, you recognize like, oh, it has nothing to do with spirituality, though. It's funny how that's often considered spiritual stuff, but spirituality is like unbelievably more subtle, it would seem. At least to me, that's what it would seem like. So I think that's one of the interesting ramifications of this is that you recognize that a lot of the things that you've maybe been involved in aren't really spiritual things as such. They're actually more forms of identity that you can attach to, which is fine, but it's just not really what this is. Other ramifications I've noticed is that speaking about this with people is impossible. There's no way to really word what that is, but you can come closer and closer and closer to what's most real or truthful within yourself when you speak to another person, such that there's some kind of mirroring or registration that seems to occur in this. And I suspect that that is what's meant by, you hear about like Shaktipat or like spiritual transmission. I suspect that that's what occurs with transmission. I've had a spiritual teacher for like 5 or 6 years, and I do often notice that after speaking with him or being in his presence, there is some sort of like clarity, because I think he mirrors what is needed for the personality to grow. But yeah, speaking about it overtly or directly as an experience is quite difficult to do, because it's not really an experience past a point. It actually seems more like, from that standpoint, that this human thing that I'm doing right now is more of the experience. Like, that's the trip, and the actual real self is kind of completely out of, like, not even in the time zone, yet also is the whole map. It's like not in the place at all, but it also is the whole place and everything else that could possibly be. And that's almost impossible to explain, obviously, especially with more linear conventional thought. There are forms of thinking and forms of understanding that can illuminate that or elucidate that, better, like quantum mechanics, for example. It's a very paradoxical kind of way of looking at material and how things could possibly exist. And obviously forms of philosophy, ontology, and epistemology, these sort of more meta-cognitive branches of reasoning and things like that. They might have more of an idea of it. But in the conventional sense, it's very difficult to talk about. And, that's not really a good or bad thing. You don't really need to talk about these things. It's just that I think, as I said, another ramification for me has been that after these things, there seem to be like certain things that are clarified or cleared out within the personality. And I think that when things are clarified or cleared out within the personality, the natural inclination is to want to share this information with other people around you, because you can see areas that they're stuck in something, and you kind of want to be like, oh, like, have you taken a step back and kind of experienced the room more closely, or the sound? And it sounds, I can imagine how insane that sounds when someone's like, oh, I have this problem in my relationship. Like, you're going to hit them with like, have you tried like really attuning to the feeling of your own body or the sound in the room, or like, you know what I mean? Like, it seems so irrelevant, and from a certain angle it is, but what you're basically trying to say is you're trying to lead them closer to the present moment such that they can have a taste of something that's eternal. And that eternal thing that you're trying to bring them towards is you understand that clarifies the personality in a way that is very difficult to do otherwise, and so you kind of want to bring that to other people. Something else is I've noticed, like, this is kind of a surprising one, and I think for good reason, a lot of people probably don't talk about this in the space, and it's definitely not something you'll hear in like Zen or something like that. But yeah, like for me, like, I'm just going to be honest with you about it. There are like certain things on a personal level that have become more, like I said before, more clear, that are surprising. Like, for example, liking myself as a relative entity, an individual, has become a bit easier after this, I've noticed. Because it feels I don't want to tear up. I'm resisting like tearing up. But I guess if it happens, it happens. There's something quite intimate about this to me. I think what it is that I've realized a lot of my life that as a, like, you know, with identifying as a relative entity and individual, I've not liked myself a lot of the time, or I've felt uncomfortable about certain things in myself or my abilities. And like, I've been very afraid, and I've spent a lot of time trying to avoid certain outcomes because of that, you know? But I think, especially recently, in light of some of this stuff that I'm talking to you about here, it's almost like a couple times I've kind of just looked at myself like in a mirror, like I've looked into my eyes, or I've like sat with myself, and I've just realized that like how vulnerable this entity is. And it's not like a bad thing or a scary thing. It can be scary, but at the same time, it's like how vulnerable and how like sort of, this word like makes me cringe sometimes, but I think it perfectly illustrates what I'm trying to say. But it's like how tender this entity is, you know, and how like it doesn't know most things, and it just spends all its time like a wind-up toy trying to make things okay, or trying to avoid things that might hurt it. And it's a totally different way of looking at self, because it's so removed from being the self that it illuminates aspects of the character and personality which still are relatively real. They exist within the relative world and context in the time-space dimension. And those things get illuminated and elucidated, and there's this great protective love, I feel. And you know, I'm not saying it's been there all the time. Actually, like, you know, even yesterday I found myself like binge eating a little bit and trying to avoid some emotions and having a really bad day. Like, I'm not perfect with any of this. I'm not saying I'm now this like loving individual who's full of care for, it's like, no, I'm imperfect as anyone else. But you know what I think's changed is I don't mind being so imperfect anymore, because I realize that it's not coming from a place of inferiority as such. It's just the way this one is. And the way this one is actually okay, and it doesn't exclude him from love, even when other people have not been able to give him that, you know? And there's kind of like a care and a tenderness in that I've really got something out of recently. Like, for example, there are certain people in my life who, you know, conventionally you would think they would give you a lot of support, or they would show you love, or they would want to be a part of your life. And I've actually found that for me, a lot of those people don't seem to give a lot of care. And I think that some of the repercussions of that is that this person has not really felt that he's worthy of that kind of love or care. And sometimes it probably has scared him when he's received it or anything that looks like it because of that. And I think that recently I've been able to get that more endogenously or naturally, or like I might just be feeling something really rough, and I might just decide, like, instead of trying to get away from it, I might just sit with it for an hour and just be there with that feeling. And that's become easier at this point, because it doesn't feel like there's so much to grab onto. When you're very self-identified all the time, it's like you don't realize how much you're clinging to being a person. But when that loosens to some degree, whether it's through meditation or psychedelics or however that happens, it does allow a lot of healing to occur by itself, because the space is cleared up and there's not much being stuck to, so it just seems like the self can move more fluidly. And that's been, in my experience at least. I think from the standpoint of Zen, something I've really liked hearing from some teachers or roshis has been that these openings that are experienced, they're not like the goal. It's not the only thing. And I see that quite clearly at this point. I see that it's, because, for me, like, I consider myself a white belt in life in general, like in pretty much every domain. And I wouldn't want to be anything else. You know what I mean? Like, I think that I like being a beginner. I like being at the starting zone, because then there's a saying by, it's not DT Suzuki, it's Shunryu Suzuki. He's another Zen teacher. I think that's his name, Shunryu. He's like one of the main guys in the Soto Zen tradition. And he said, like, something to the effect of, like, a full mind, like an expert mind is deprived of a lot of possibilities, where a beginner's mind is always free to explore possibilities, because there's the openness to what is. So not knowing and not really knowing how it's going to go, what's going to happen, can open you up very much to the wonder of life, I feel. And so I'm happy being in a place of a beginner. And I feel like, if anything, the things that I've been speaking about in this video have actually, they've not brought me to a certain place. It's almost like they've removed things from the surrounding environment that have let the natural environment shine through more naturally as an environment, as scenery. And yeah, from the Zen standpoint, they say this is not like some end point, but practice should go on your whole life. Whatever it is you're doing, you should continue to practice. You should continue to sit in Zazen. But you don't have to approach it, I guess, in the same way, where it's like, oh, I'm going to sit for this long every day or I'm fucked. It's not like that. It's more like you practice just to practice, like the point of the practice is just to show up and do the practice. And that's just a part of your life. And there is obviously little subtle things that you come to, I think, appreciate about your practice. Like if you're sitting shikantaza, I think you can come to enjoy the body balance and just the peace of sitting naturally in that position and just allowing life to occur. And the sort of subtle fluidity of experience flowing right through you, and even the sense of a body and a mind flowing through time in that way, and even knowing that time is something that's not really there. It's like they're like ghosts of truth, echoes, but I think you can appreciate that more when you're less clung on. And same with koan, like centering yourself to become so one-pointed that you're penetrating through the nature of experience. I think these things can be experienced more intimately over time. So I think it's important to continue practicing, and for me, that's what I intend to do. But anyway, there are some just random free associative thoughts and feelings on some things that are often very difficult to explain, but I do feel that I did a pretty good job of touching on some of it. And if you relate or you have some experience in this in yourself, I think it would seem a lot more natural to you. And if not, and you had questions, or I'd love to hear from you down below with it. My email is also down below. I'm going to cut it off there. I hope you're having a beautiful day. If you enjoyed this and you got something out of it and you're not already, I appreciate you subscribing to the channel, liking, sharing this, commenting for the algorithm, all that. And I will see you very soon. Bye-bye.